Reform candidates win big at the NRA Annual Meeting. Plus, we discuss the group's continued financial woes. All this and more on the news update.
No, the devil's got no hold on me.
All right, ladies and gentlemen, welcome back to the news update. I'm contributing writer Jake Fogleman, joined as always by Reload founder Stephen Gutowski, coming to us from the farm, which I'm sure we'll touch on a little bit later at the end of the show here. But Stephen, as I mentioned, is the founder of The Reload, and you can go head on over to thereload.com and sign up for our free newsletter to stay up to date on all things guns in America every week. And speaking of this week's news, you just came back from the NRA Annual Meeting, and this was a particularly newsworthy annual meeting as far as the last few have gone. And if you want to tell us a little bit about what happened.
Yeah, it really was very newsworthy compared to the last several. And doing a lot of traveling because I was at that in person in Dallas, Texas, at the K. Bailey Hutchinson Convention Center, I believe it's called. It's always funny when they name convention centers after people who are still alive, especially politicians who are still alive. It's quite the thing. But either way, nice facility. They've had the annual meeting there in the past, but this year was extremely consequential. And I was actually the only reporter that was at the most consequential part of the meeting, which technically it happened after the end. Technically, the board meeting is separate from the annual meeting. They just do it right after the annual meeting in the same location. I think mainly out of convenience. It makes a lot of sense to do it that way. But that's where all the big news happened. You know, the annual meeting had President Trump speak, or former President Trump speak there, and he announced gun owners for Trump, which I think is kind of just anything for politician effort. I don't know if there's anything particularly special to it, but he announced that. You can get a shirt that says gun owners for Trump, or a sign, right? Just like farmers for Biden or whatever. You know, they do this. Basically, every politician does this thing. But it was kind of funny. He did say gun owners don't vote to a bunch of political activists in a giant meeting. But, you know, there's probably, if more gun owners should vote, I think is a common idea inside of the gun rights movement. So not all that outrageous of a thing to say, I suppose. But yes, beyond that, the board meeting featured much more actual news. The Trump speech was a Trump speech. It got a little bit weird. I guess now he does like a sort of like almost a theatrical thing at the end where their music comes on and he starts giving kind of a speech over the music. But ancillary to what we're talking about, sorry, it was just a very strange experience. And even having been to a Trump speech back in February at the previous NRA event, that kind of threw me off. It's a little weird, but the crowd stayed. More of the crowd stayed for longer than at the Pennsylvania speech. So I don't know if that says what crowds and speeches can tell you about electoral politics. Usually not that much, but
right.
Regardless, after that all happened, the board meeting produced really, frankly, shocking results. We talked right on the show about how reformers had won board seats. They had a slate of reformers that ran, and they all won, and they got a lot of votes comparatively to the other candidates. And that was a good sign for the reform. It was kind of the first real concrete sign that NRA members support these guys, the people who want significant change at the NRA, want new leadership. But it was still only 5 people out of 76 who are like these vocal, outspoken reformers. And so there's a pretty big uphill climb to right the ship, or to try and go in the direction that they want, to put in the leadership that they would like to see. And so going into the meeting, it was not a sure thing that was going to happen. I mean, there's 76 board members. I think something like 67 actually showed up to the meeting, which is actually quite a lot. Usually don't get nearly that many board members to show up to these things. Only really happens when there's some sort of big event like 2019 or this year. And it worked. that was the shocking thing. It was really kind of a roller coaster, especially for the reformers. Like, it was a bit of an emotional roller coaster for them, as I watched them during this meeting, because it started off. Well, first off, there was the members meeting the day before, or 2 days before, and that went very poorly for the previous leadership, for NRA leadership. President Charles Cotton and interim CEO and Executive Vice President Andrew Rule-Nundum. They were the only real resolution that got voted on and debated was about moving the NRA's headquarters from Virginia to Texas, which wouldn't have any legal impact. Really just would be moving buildings from Virginia to Texas, and which, I think the reformers were like, maybe this could make sense, but they didn't see they weren't convinced of the need to do it, and they were really skeptical about the cost to the organization.
Sorry to cut you off. What is there? Because I remember during the trial, obviously, they tried to do this as a gambit for bankruptcy law. But what is the argument now for relocating to Texas?
Yeah, that was the thing about this. It's kind of like a vestigial part of that bankruptcy strategy, where the argument back then, like you noted, was, well, the NRA is chartered in New York, and so that means that New York's Attorney General, who's a Democrat who has been publicly antagonistic towards the NRA, is called them a terrorist organization, and is the one prosecuting their corruption case, the civil corruption case. And they wanted to, the argument was, we need to get out of New York and move to a friendly place like Texas. And they filed bankruptcy in Texas, using some corporate maneuvering to start an entity there and file bankruptcy for the whole organization in Texas. It didn't work. The bankruptcy judge dismissed the case. They still had to go through this New York trial, which they lost the first half of. The jury ruled against both Wayne LaPierre as having essentially taken money from the group to pay for his personal expenses, and to the tune of millions and millions of dollars, and $5.5 million is what the jury found. And then also that the NRA didn't safeguard its assets. So that all still happens, and that trial is still ongoing, as we've covered here. But through that, there's been a desire amongst the leadership to move anyway. And this is really a separate thing. It wouldn't change anything about their charter or their anything in this case. It would literally just be a moving of buildings, which the NRA is already not in New York as far as its headquarters go. It's in Fairfax, Virginia, which is just outside of Washington, D.C. And so this would just move the headquarters from that location to somewhere in Texas. They haven't found a place yet. But yeah, they didn't. That was one of the questions, is like, what was the purpose of doing this? The main arguments that they made on stage were essentially, Virginia is becoming more liberal, especially Northern Virginia. And so it's harder to find people to work for the NRA was one of the arguments they made. It would be less expensive to hire somebody somewhere in Texas. And yeah, it's kind of a retreat argument. Like, we need to flee Virginia for a safer haven like Texas, because Virginia's too liberal, which is honestly a little bit of a weird argument to me. Certainly, Virginia has trended bluer over time, but it has a Republican governor, and the legislature is Democrat, but it's only one vote majorities in either one of those chambers. So it's not exactly Massachusetts, right?
Right.
And also, there's a significant problem, I think, with moving away from DC as the NRA.
Yeah, that was my question. Is proximity to DC seems to be kind of core to their mission, right? Is to be able to be influential on the Hill, and that's So
there's a lot of drawbacks, but mainly, and look, yes, the area around DC is more liberal for sure, and DC itself is more liberal. But there are plenty of conservative activists that live there and operate most of the political groups that on the right. I mean, that's not it's not that difficult to find people who would probably be willing to work for the NRA. In fact, that's that kind of person who wants to be involved in national politics. That's where they go. They go to Washington, D.C. They go to the D.C. metro area. That's where I am from here on the farm, Pennsylvania. And I moved to Washington, D.C. to work for the Media Research Center when I first began my career, because that's where, if you want to be involved in national politics, that's where you go and live. So there aren't people like that in Texas, and there's lots of great people in Texas. And Texas is a wonderful state. So I really enjoyed eating the barbecue there when I was down there, and certainly they have a great reputation for gun ownership, but you don't go to Dallas if you're looking to get involved in national politics. It's just, you don't go to Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania either. You know what I mean?
Right.
So, but honestly, most of the fight over this in the members meeting boiled down to the cost. Like, the NRA, as we will talk about here, I'm sure in a minute, is in really bad financial shape, and it's only getting worse. And I think the reformers who didn't like this idea were extremely skeptical of the argument that leadership was putting out at the time, that Cotton and Andrew Rowland-Undham were making about how much this would cost. Because they essentially, one, they didn't have any concrete numbers, and two, they said, Andrew argued at one point that they would be able to, that the move would be more or less free because they'd be able to sell sort of sponsorship rights for moving the museum down somewhere in Texas. And everyone who got up to speak was really rather opposed to this, and actually thought it was going to cost the organization a lot of money. There was one board member who actually, Bockenberg, who ended up winning the first vice president's race on the sort of reform ticket, if you want to call it that, reform slate, alternative ticket. He said there was an estimate that it could cost him upwards of $80 million. I don't know if that's true. But Cotton and Rowland-Undham didn't offer any hard numbers on what it would cost. So this went over very poorly, and so did kind of the attitude of Cotton, especially during this meeting. He was sort of condescending to a lot of these board members who got up to speak in opposition to the Texas move. Amanda Suffolk was one of those, and he complained that Bockenberg made like a sarcastic comment about how he hadn't shown up to the board meetings frequently in the past. And he made a sarcastic comment or asked a sarcastic question to Amanda Suffolk about how long she'd been on the board, and which actually got a lot of boos in the room. So that it did not go over well. When they put that up for a vote in the members meeting, it failed. Now it was just a resolution to recommend the move. So it wasn't binding or anything like that. They still could have gone through with it. But once you got to the board meeting, so that was your first sign that things were not going well for, Charles Cotton or Andrew Rowland-Undham or the other members of now previous leadership to sort of foreshadow what's happening here. Once you got to the board meeting, it was a bit of a roller coaster, though, because it started off with a fight over whether or not these elections should be held in open session, where anyone present, any member attending or anyone else watching could stay and watch the debate over who should be elected to leadership positions, or whether they should go into executive session and basically kick everyone out who's not a board member or NRA staff. And so they ended up voting. The former leadership wanted it to be an executive session, but the board ended up voting to keep it open. However, once you got to the president's election, which was the very first one, it was Owen Buzz Mills against former Congressman Bob Barr, Bob Barr was first vice president going into this, and he was picked by the nominating committee. So this is how I would differentiate the two sides. The easiest way to think about it for this election was there was who was put up by the nominating committee, which it was controlled primarily by former leadership, by Wayne LaPierre's allies. That's who a lot of people were on that side of things. And so they put up one slate of people they thought should fill these leadership positions. And then when each election came up, the reformers would nominate somebody else to run against the nominating committee's slate. And so you had the nominating committee and the reformers, and those were the two sides. And the first fight was outside of that vote to keep open the elections. The first fight was over the president, and that's where things started to look really bad for the reformers, because they'd won this vote to keep the elections open, but then they lost the president's race. Bob Barr beat Owen Buzz Mills, and Buzz Mills is the only one I should note, because I think it's somewhat important for, this question that we'll get to later as to whether this is real change that you're seeing. But Buzz Mills is the only one who ran for one of these leadership positions that was a vocal reformer before all this started. He spoke out publicly. He's talked to us in the past. He's done a number of interviews complaining about leadership, complaining about the corruption, complaining about LaPierre, complaining about the Brewer law firm. And so he lost his race to be president. And a lot of the reformers were really dejected at that point. They thought they were going to lose the rest of these races too, which, because that would be the natural assumption, that if you're going to vote for the nominating committee candidate in the president's race, that it's likely that you'll keep going in that direction. However, then they broke for lunch. And in fact, some of the reformers just left at that point. And, then we saw a total turnaround from that point. The first vice president race, the reformers won that. Bakenberg won. Second vice president, you had Mark Bond won that as the reform candidate. And then you had the big election, which was the CEO and executive vice president. And you had Ronnie Barrett versus Doug Hamlin. And Ronnie Barrett obviously has a huge name recognition advantage there. He is the one who invented the Barrett 50 cal rifle and ran the Barrett company. So he was put up by the nominating committee. Now, it was expected for a long time that it would be Charles Cotton would be the nominating committee pick, the former leadership pick. But I think because of what happened at the members meeting and how poorly that went over with both the members there and a lot of the board members who attended, they swapped out Cotton for Ronnie Barrett, who, to be fair to Ronnie Barrett, he didn't, Bob Barr, when he ran, he made some unhappy comments. I don't know. He attacked Buzz Mills for complaining publicly about what had happened. And so you didn't see that when Ronnie Barrett came up. He wasn't, he really kind of ran on a more reconciliation, short-term interim EVP kind of position where he would go out and use his notoriety to try and help unify everyone on the board and also bring members back to the NRA. And it was a fairly magnanimous, yeah. Magnanimous. There you go. Election. And it was fairly magnanimous through the whole thing. There wasn't a lot of shouting and cursing and whatever. It was a fairly civil proceeding that they went through during these elections. And
sorry to jump in, because that brings up an interesting question is, because, you talk about some of the atmosphere at the members meeting and then the board meeting. What was the energy in the room like? Because, a lot of these votes, even though the latter half of the elections, the so-called reform candidates won, but they weren't huge wins, right? The votes were pretty evenly split. And so how did the sort of reform side, how did they seem in the aftermath? And how did the sort of the loyalists picked candidates and that side, that faction, seem to react after the elections? I'm curious what the energy was like.
Yeah, so it's very different from the members meeting, where you had a little bit more of that rowdiness. Not as much as 2019. It never got to that level of the shouting and yelling that you saw, or the sort of chaos that ensued. But it was a bit more rowdy in the members meeting than it was in the board meeting. The board meeting was relatively calm. They had, each side would, these elections, they had people come up and support the candidate would give a 3-minute talk, and then you'd have their supporters stand up and give like 30-second, 1-minute speech on why they think that person should win. And it was fairly cordial through all that. And even though the board was clearly fairly split, because the most any of these reform candidates got was like 36 votes. And Doug Hamlin ended up winning, which is the most important role. That CEO, executive vice president role was the old Wayne LaPierre position. And it's the one that has the most power of any of these leadership roles in the organization. So the reformers winning that one, I think, is one of the main reasons why they ended up coming away extremely happy at the end of it. Even the people who've been the most critical were pretty satisfied with how the election went. I spoke to Jeff Knox immediately afterwards, first time on the board, but he's been an activist against Wayne LaPierre and NRA leadership for decades, since his father initially got in a fight with Wayne LaPierre and Ackerman McQueen back in the 90s. So even he was pretty happy with the outcome of the election. I don't think that any of them believe it wasn't a clean sweep, right? And it's not entirely clear how far they're going to be able to take things with this, but they have most of the levers of power at the NRA now, because they also ended up getting a majority, from what I understand, on the nominating committee. Now we have Phil Journey, who's another reformer board member. He's been one of the outspoken ones. He's been on the show before. We have him this week. So when the show comes out on Sunday for members, or on Monday for everybody else, we'll get a little bit deeper into how the reformers feel about things. But I can say that in the immediate after, like I said, it was a roller coaster, because after Bob Barr won the presidency and Buzz Mills lost, people on the reform activists who were there were pretty dejected at that point. Really thought that was it. Because the assumption would be, oh, that's how all these elections are going to go. They're going to end up voting for the nominating committee candidates. But there was something. Former Senator Larry Craig, who's on the NRA board, he got up early on and in the Bob Barr election in support of Bob Barr, and his argument was that they needed change, but also consistency, that they needed to meld the two together. And honestly, it feels like that's kind of where the board ended up coming down, that they didn't want a clean sweep and a total change of leadership. They wanted some consistency. And so they kept Bob Barr, put him as president, and then they elected reformers to the other positions, including EVP. And, and the reformers seemed like they were willing to compromise as well, because again, like other than Buzz Mills, you didn't get these other positions filled by extremely vocal dissident board members, people who, were pushed off the board and then kind of made it back on through petition. This last election, those were not. It wasn't Rocky Marshall and Phil Journey and Jeff Knox who ended up getting these spots. It was other people that they were comfortable supporting, but perhaps didn't have this hadn't caused the same kind of offense to some of the other board members. Right. Like that's kind of where it feels like it came out.
Yeah.
Which does lead to the question. Right.
I was going to say that naturally leads into sort of the members piece you wrote for us this week, which also in part touches on another news report you did, but about how much is this, do you think, Is this actually a sign of reform because it is sort of, like you said, a half measure almost? They didn't want to totally rock the boat, but they did, in fact, get some reform candidates on the board. And how much is that going to change the organization, and especially in light of some of the challenges that they still face, as you reported on this week? So I'm curious to hear your thoughts on that.
Yeah, I mean, that's the ultimate question. Like, these guys who won, Bockenberg had been a little bit vocal, at least inside of the organization. He had sent an email. He was the guy who suggested Trump Jr. might be willing to come in and play a leadership role at the NRA, which maybe I could touch on this for a second too. These are not folks. When I say reformers, this isn't like people who are going to come in and take the NRA in a totally different political direction necessarily. You know, there might be some changes in approach or strategy or whatever, but you're very unlikely to see them, back away from Donald Trump, for instance. I mean, Bockenberg spent money to hire a firm to try and prove that the 2020 election was stolen, and then was sued by that firm afterwards over the dispute when they didn't come up with the evidence he wanted. And so, you know, not a guy who's going to come in and say, we need to be more moderate, or we need to be,
right.
We need to try and approach our politics different, or distance from Donald Trump or whatever. Like, that's not, I think, at all what you're going to see from this group of reformers. What these reformers want is internal controls at the NRA to improve, and transparency for finances, and they want to see the group get back on track to growing membership again, and address a lot of these issues that came up during the corruption scandal. That's what they want, not a change in the NRA's politics necessarily. Other than that, Doug Hamlin is an insider, right? Like, he's somebody who ran their publications department for a decade. He's been there through this whole scandal. He's not an outsider. He's not somebody who has vocally come out for leadership changes in the past, publicly at least. I have sources that I have, current and former NRA staff, have said that publications generally was unhappy during this whole scandal, that they didn't, that they were unhappy with some of the things that came out about Wayne LaPierre, but that's all we really have to go off at this point. And some of his comments. He has come out and acknowledged the problems. That there's a change in tone already, I would say. Right? I mean, you remember how the NRA sort of used to deal with this, which was just to lay all of the blame on New York Attorney General, which, there's some legitimate critiques there, of course, about her approach and things she said in public, attacking the NRA as a terrorist organization. There's legitimate critiques of her, but previous leadership that was it. That was the whole explanation, that everything was fixed. There may have been a few problems, but everything got fixed, right? That's basically, that's how you recall it, right? That's essentially.
Yeah. Anytime we reported on a story and we'd reach out for comment, that was essentially the comment: is this is a witch hunt, and this is all about trying to take down the NRA, and any problems that might exist. Like you said, they would say, "Oh, those are long fixed and nothing to see here."
Right. So that's not what Doug Hamlin is saying. Now they still attack the Attorney General and New York,
sure.
And I don't think that's going to stop. And like I said, there's some legitimacy to those complaints, so that's fair enough. But Doug Hamlin has already acknowledged that there are issues at the NRA that need to be fixed, and that it's in a poor financial shape, and that they need to bring more transparency, and they need to make significant, substantial changes to try and re-engage their membership, to try and bring back the people that they've lost. Because there's, and that's just that alone, the sort of acknowledgement of reality is a pretty big.
It is a shift.
Yeah. It says something. And he was willing to talk to me. I had this whole fight when the board meeting started. I got in, I sat down like I have a bunch of times in the past, and I've been to a bunch of these board meetings, right? Almost always the only reporter that goes to them. And basically, they're pretty inconsistent about their policy of who can attend the board meetings, the open sessions, in that sometimes they say you have to be an active NRA member. Sometimes they don't mind if I go in and watch as just a reporter. Now, I prefer not to carry a membership, just to explain this to everybody, because I report on the NRA, and it's just cleaner that way to not have anyone potentially questioning my ethics or the reporting that we do because I have an NRA membership. Now, I've been an NRA certified instructor for years and years. It's a little bit different than being a member, right? It's going through a course and having a certificate and being able to train people is a little bit different than being a member of the organization. But I don't mind having an NRA membership. I don't have an opposition to the work that they do or the mission, the basic mission that they have, right? There's critiques about how they go about it, or, there's plenty of things I'll critique about them and skeptical coverage that people can read it and judge for themselves what they think. But I don't mind carrying a membership. It doesn't, if I need to do that to be able to get access to the board meetings to properly cover them, that's fine. But generally, I think it's preferable not to have one in an organization that I cover. Like if I was covering AARP for a living and I was a bit older than that, so I'm not just thinking of a membership organization everybody knows as an example, but I prefer not to carry a membership if I was going to cover them. Now, I don't think it changes my view on things personally, but other people, might view that as a negative when they look at my coverage. So I prefer not to have it, but I'm willing to do it if that's what it requires to get the stories. That's just how it is. And I don't have an inherent opposition to reporters or anyone else having these sorts of memberships. I think you can report fairly, even being an NRA member on the NRA. But so, they let me in. Then when I went to the bathroom and tried to go back in, then they told me I couldn't come in because my membership had lapsed years ago. And I was like, okay, fine. I will renew my membership. And then they took quite a while, probably about an hour, to verify that I'd renewed they wouldn't accept the email as proof. And it's just like the emblematic of how they've treated me and press throughout this whole thing. And then, Doug Hamlin became AVP. He talked to me right after that for comment for the story. And his message was one that was of reform. Now, it wasn't, a fire breathing message about how bad Wayne LaPierre is or how bad, other members. It wasn't anything like that. Right. So it's not that hardcore reform message or what have you. So it's a different approach. He's definitely trying to take a bit more of a oh my gosh, another word I'm not going to be able to say. He's looking for reconciliation there. Now there's a term.
Is reconciliatory a word?
Reconciliatory. Probably. I think that's a word. I would use it in Scrabble, I guess. Anyway, that's more of that's what he's clearly going for. I think he's not. And I think that's, the board 36 to 21, I think is not like an overwhelming. It's more like we got enough people to start this ball rolling. Maybe and I think the reformers, part of their plan is to do this again next year, try and get more reform-minded board members on and so forth. But he's already made a couple of substantive changes though. But that's the thing. Like you can look at the approach and it makes sense to wait and see and wait for actions and look at how they approach this trial. Now they got to move fast because the trial starts in July. That's less than 2 months from now. This trial is going to begin. And so that's another question too, whether they can really garner enough changes in that time to make a big difference, or whether they can settle the case, or what they're going to do at all, their legal strategy. Are they going to get rid of a brewer firm? Are they going to stay with them but change tactics? Are they just going to keep going as things have been in court? We don't know yet. We do know that Hamlin has already made a couple of changes. One, which he actually promised in his speech to the board as part of his platform, is that he's going to bring back a guy named Joe DeBergalis, who was running general operations, sort of all the programs people know about the NRA, safety and training, and a number of other things, the competition, the police relations stuff. That he's bringing him back to run that. Now DeBergalis had been cast aside in sort of a maneuvering by Wayne LaPierre and his allies, where they took Andrew Rulanundum, who was the longtime spokesperson for the NRA and a close Wayne ally, and they fired DeBergalis, moved Andrew to that position, because once Wayne LaPierre resigned, that was the position that was going to become interim EVP. And so that's how Rulanundum became EVP. So Hamlin's already kind of undoing that. He also canceled the move to Texas, or at least put it on hold. So he announced that in an email to staff yesterday, which we reported in a piece that we did. And he also split up the role that John Fraser has. So John Fraser was the secretary and the general counsel for the NRA. Now, he was found to have submitted materially false statements to the government in the NRA's financial disclosure forms, essentially in their 990 and the state equivalent of that. So that was something that happened during the jury trial. So now Fraser is no longer going to be general counsel. He's still going to be secretary, and he won that election against a reform, somebody who was put up. I wasn't there for that because I had to catch my flight back. I had to leave after the EVP election. The board meeting went on for quite a while. It was a bit of a marathon. But Fraser will still be there, but he won't be general counsel anymore. Hamlin has appointed somebody else to that role. So there's three moves already, and it's only been a couple of days. So obviously there's a lot more I think that needs to be done, especially given the other story we've had, right? Which, if you want to give people a little bit of a rundown what that was. Yeah.
So you have the legal stuff still hanging over their heads as they're trying to make these early reforms. And there's, like you said, there's some signs that things are shifting, but they kind of also have this big financial sword hanging over their heads because you obtained some of their annual reports, the latest annual reports, and it's a continuation of what we've seen, which they're in real bad financial shape. Revenue's continuing to fall. They had to sell off something like $44 million in their assets in order to help bolster their financials. So it's nice. Internal controls are important, but also maybe recouping some of the lost membership and trying to get the financial ship back on track is, I think, the big challenge ahead.
Oh yeah, because they lost, what was it, $20 million in dues, and I believe they were down by like $60 million in revenue.
Yep, year over year, 60.5.
Yeah. So that, 21.4 million loss in dues, $15.8 million loss in contributions, overall 60.5 million year over year revenue drop. Now, some of that, I will say, the NRA is like a lot of political organizations or organizations that are heavily involved in politics, is cyclical. So 2022 was an election year. It likely received more fundraising during 2022 than you would expect to see in 2023. So some of this may be explained a little bit. I don't think to this extreme degree, certainly not. But some of this is probably related to that. But they still were in the red again, and they've been running in the red for so long. And the dues have been dropping and dropping and dropping. They haven't really gone back up at all since 2018. So this is It's honestly not clear how much longer they could keep going with this trajectory.
Right. And once again,
Even
legal
though-
fees were the huge top line item that I think you mentioned in the piece. Their legal fees line item was more than all the others combined, or at least like the legislative stuff, the safety and training that most people publicly associate the NRA with. All of that combined was less than they spent on legal fees, which is a huge problem.
It is, absolutely. And that's one of the big complaints of the reformers, is that they've complained about how much they're spending on this outside firm, the Brewer firm. So I don't know if there's going to be changes with that or not. It may be difficult to change your lawyer 2 months out from the second half of a trial.
Yeah.
I don't know if they're going to do that. We'll see. Maybe they'll settle. I don't know. Journey gives a bit more insight into what the reformers are thinking on the long interview podcast that we've got coming up for you guys. But as far as where things stand now for the NRA, they're in dire straits. And they absolutely need to figure something out, because they're not going to have much longer. But real quick, let's just zoom through. We only had a couple other things to touch on today. You had a story this week about a new TRO, right?
That's right. Yeah. So outside of the NRA stuff, the Biden administration's new quote unquote engaged in the business rule. This is the one, if listeners will recall, is aimed at getting more private gun sellers, so folks that sell used guns, to obtain federal firearms licenses. They intentionally, the language, it came from the Bipartisan Safer Communities Act, which did make a statutory change to the language of who's engaged in the business, very slight. And I think the ATF took that and left it a little bit vague. As you reported when the rule was published, it's they don't really give you a definitive threshold of when you need to obtain an FFL. That even if you just consider selling one gun, if your motivation is profit, you potentially need to go get an FFL.
Yeah. Similar stuff to what they'd been saying, but kind of all smashed together into one rule that gives the implication that maybe everybody who sells used guns should get a FFL, perhaps.
Right. And
but we're not
a federal Right. And a federal judge took issue with that, at least in a very narrow sense. So he issued this is a district judge in Texas, issued a temporary restraining order against the rule. It was issued right before the rule set to take effect this week. And now it does not apply in Texas or to the members of Gun Owners of America, VCDL in Virginia. And there's, I think, Tennessee Firearms Association was the third. So a handful of gun rights groups in the state of Texas are not covered under this rule, at least for the next couple of weeks while they do subsequent hearings. So a little interesting to see a hole get poked in that rule right away. It is in effect in the other 49 states and to folks that aren't members of these groups, but right off the bat to see a hole poked in this new rule is interesting.
Yep. More legal trouble for these executive actions that President Biden has taken to try and restrict firearms without having to pass new legislation. So speaking of which, actually, we have some news on the Supreme Court case dealing with bump stocks. That one has, this is kind of a in the weeds explanation. Mark Smith, who's been a guest on the show in the past, a conservative Second Amendment lawyer, who gives a lot of really good analysis over on Four Boxes Diner for people who haven't checked that out before. It's a YouTube channel. But he pointed out that while the Supreme Court issued some opinions yesterday, none of them were Second Amendment cases or really gun-related cases. There was an armed career criminal case, but that was more about what sorts of charges in state charges qualify. But the more important aspect was who wrote the opinions. So one of the cases that came out yesterday was from the February sitting where the judges heard oral arguments in cases in February, and it was issued by Justice Roberts, which means that for that February sitting, you've had all of the liberal justices and Justice Roberts issue opinions from it, which most likely means that one of the remaining conservative justices is going to write that decision in Cargill v. Garland, which is the bump stock ban case, which doesn't guarantee any particular outcome, of course, but does suggest that perhaps Cargill may be successful. He might prevail, and the bump stock ban may be struck down, which is kind of where we've been leaning. on this after oral arguments. It was a little bit of a mixed bag in the oral arguments, but it did seem like the conservative justices had issues with the way the ATF reinterpreted they might be open to a bump stock ban, but maybe not the way that the ATF went about doing it, as trying to reclassify them as machine guns, and
Right.
questioned whether that fit the statute or not, which is kind of the core question to a lot of these ATF rules that the Biden administration has put out. But so, that was some Supreme Court news. That'll be interesting. And kind of one of those things where the Supreme Court gives you so little until they give you the opinion that everybody's dissecting the minutia of this stuff.
Yeah, they're always trying to read the tea leaves. And to your point, the remaining 5 conservative justices tend to be the ones most skeptical of administrative agency powers. So that's another factor that sort of, like you said, it's not a guarantee, but at least suggests that potentially Cargill could come out on top.
Yeah, and I think actually that's probably one of the more concrete tea leaves to read of these things.
Sure.
Because there is generally they tend to follow this pattern of how they release opinions, and does imply that one of these conservative justices is going to write Cargill, which should be interesting. We'll see. It doesn't guarantee anything, but it's a good sign for people who want to see that rule overturned.
Yeah. And then one last Supreme Court bit of news that we want to hit on from the newsletter this week, from the links. So Supreme Court actually just denied certiorari in the Bianchi case, which is Maryland's assault weapon ban. This is sort of the controversial one that was originally before the Supreme Court. And then after they decided Bruin, they kicked it back to the Fourth Circuit. The Fourth Circuit heard oral arguments again in it almost immediately, December 2022, which is just a few months after Bruin, and then never issued an opinion. Over a year went by and they didn't issue an opinion. And then without ever issuing an opinion, the en banc court decided to take it up and then decide, we have it now. And so gun rights advocates got mad and appealed to the Supreme Court to step in.
I think that actually Mark Smith, we had him on the show to talk about that whole weird ordeal that they went through with the Maryland assault weapons ban case, and why that was fairly outrageous the way that they did it. So people should listen to that episode actually if they want some more background on this. But the important thing here, is that the Supreme Court denied certiorari, which means they're not going to take up this case. Now they said that it was denied before judgment, so there's no final judgment in this case yet. The Fourth Circuit's en banc panel hasn't issued an opinion, but the gun rights advocates were trying to get the court to intervene before that happened, in part because of this whole procedural maneuvering that the Fourth Circuit did here. But however, that was not the only assault weapons ban case, and a number of the other ones were relisted. So it doesn't mean that the court's not going to take up this issue.
Yeah, so they had the consolidated Illinois cases, the state bans and the local bans were all kind of wrapped up into this big case. And that was also at that conference hearing. And they decided to kick that over for another day. So the soonest we'll get an update on that is next week after this comes out. And of course, we'll stay on top of that. But so there's still a live proposition that perhaps they'll decide to take up an assault weapon ban case.
And that tells us, I think, a lot less. It's a lot less concrete than the other one.
Right, agreed.
Relisting cases or denying cert before judgment or whatever, these aren't things that really give you that much insight into what the final outcome of a case might be.
Agreed.
A lot of major Supreme Court decisions were relisted dozens of times, like a bunch of times, a dozen or more times before they actually got heard. So, and this court, as we discussed a couple of podcasts ago, has been really lazy might be the wrong word, or too mean. I don't know, but they aren't taking a lot of cases anymore. They don't take very many cases. So some things can just get relisted a bunch because of that, I think. But we'll keep on top of it. And they're not weighing in yet. That's for sure. That's the main thing to take away. They're not, they don't seem very eager to get into the assault weapons ban fight. Although, our timeline, I think normal people timeline versus court timeline is pretty different. It's only been 2 years since Bruin happened. They waited 14 years between Heller and Bruin. So the timeline for courts is a bit slowed down. They move in slow motion compared to the rest of us.
Yeah, no, it's an important distinction. But before we wrap up here, I know you wanted to mention the fact that you're on the farm here in Pennsylvania. And is that what you're doing this Memorial Day weekend as we're recording here? Is plan to stay up there?
Yeah, well, my mom's in France and for a wedding. So
wow.
I'm up here for a whole week. I'll head back on Monday. But, it's actually this is the ideal time kind of before it gets too hot or too cold, because the horses can be out for pretty much the whole day. Just have to feed them and let them back out again. So it's not too hot in the old farmhouse. And so it's quite beautiful. The weather's quite nice. It's relaxing when I'm not trying to scramble to, break news which, given all the stuff that I brought back from the NRA Annual Meeting, I didn't have a lot of time to just relax, but I should this weekend. So looking forward to that. But yeah, how about you? What are you doing for Memorial Day? You got any plans?
Yeah, nothing concrete yet. The fiance and I are hopefully going to do a little wedding planning this weekend, and then probably on Memorial Day itself, usually our friends like to get together and have like a barbecue or something like that. We're hoping the weather cooperates this year. It's the same thing here. It's been kind of in that good betweener stage where it's not too hot yet and it hasn't been cold at all. So yeah, hopefully it stays nice and we can cook some burgers and dogs and just hang out on Memorial Day.
Springtime, always nice. Always nice. But yeah, that's all I've got going on. My dad's still a bit sick, so if anyone could say some prayers for him, I'm hoping to see him while I'm up here as well, probably later today. So hopefully he'll be doing okay. He has cancer, so he's been going through a bunch of treatments that are never fun, but have been working. So that's the positive thing. But always appreciate some prayers from folks out there on that. But yeah, I think that's all we've got for you this week. If you want to get that podcast with Phil Journey and get the sort of reformer inside view early, you can head over to thereload.com and buy a membership. And that'll get you early access to the podcast, as well as the opportunity to appear on the show. We've had 2 member segments the last 2 weeks. So I've been pretty hyped about that. They've been really good segments too. I'm always impressed by the kind of folks who buy a membership. They tend to be, really intelligent and really active and interesting too. Wide variety of people, all sorts of backgrounds and walks of lives, from lawyers to just, regular folks, and from all different political backgrounds too. I think it's really been great to be able to be a resource for a whole variety of people out there in the firearms owning community, or anyone who's just interested in firearms news as well. But yeah, head over to reload.com, check out our membership options today. If you want to help support our reporting, this is the only reason that I can go to the NRA Annual Meeting, to be the only reporter in the room when these major changes are happening, is because people buy memberships and fund our reporting. That's just the bottom line. That's just reality. So we appreciate everyone who is able to do that. But that's all we've got for you this week. We will see you guys again real soon.